Hello everyone, my name's Thomas. This is my interpretation of the Indigenous group presentation presented individually today. Before I begin my individual presentation, I want to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians, both past, present and emerging, of the various locations we will meet upon today, and recognise their continued relationship and responsibility to these lands, waters and skies. So today I am presenting my findings surrounding Indigenous activism and refusal in relation to issues surrounding child protection. This was a very interesting topic that I was able to research and find more knowledge surrounding the topic. As it is a very complex topic and time doesn't permit me to go into super heavy detail, so I'm just going to keep it short and simple today and kind of just hit you with the points that stood out the most for me. First things first, I want to discuss the stolen generation and sort of explain, for those who might not be super familiar with it, we've discussed it this semester, and I just want to kind of go over it and take a deeper dive into that. So for those who aren't too familiar, the Stolen Generation was an event period roughly between 1910 and 1970 where the government enforced assimilation upon the First Nations children. And for those, probably the most easiest way I can explain assimilation is it's pretty much consisted of the Indigenous children being forcefully integrated into white society and being raised in white culture in the hope of diluting the Indigenous culture. And it was actually social workers were the ones who removed the children from their homes, acting from government instruction. Of course, if you had a child and that child was removed, there would be negative consequences, and this removal greatly impacted the Indigenous community and had detrimental consequences for the families affected. These life-altering consequences included a decline in mental health and a rise in suicides. The families affected have continued to be impacted by this tragic event until present day. So fast forward 100 years roughly, the families that were affected by the Stolen Generations are still being affected today. It's very important for me to discuss the resistance of the Indigenous people. They didn't just sit back and watch as their lands and their children were taken away from them. They fought back to the point where things got really violent and dangerous for everyone involved. Eventually, they lost the battle, but to this day, Indigenous communities around Australia continue to fight for what's rightfully theirs. In more recent years, the Australian government has tried to do their best to compensate those Aboriginal families affected by the Stolen Generation. These compensations consist of policy changes, law changes, efforts in finding and reconnecting families, rehabilitation services for survivors, and education and training made available for all Australians. Because of the events of the Stolen Generation and the abuse experienced by Indigenous children involved, today in Australia, our society as a whole are very much aware and conscious of the events that have happened and have made efforts to make sure things like that don't happen again. And there's several organisations throughout Australia that try their best to advocate for Indigenous children and Indigenous families and communities and do their best to keep those families together. One of those organisations are Grandmothers Against Removal, and they have devised an action plan to ensure these events don't happen again. They advocate for the First Nations children from being forcefully removed from their immediate families and fight for their rights and protection. Just before I close, I just want to say how much I've enjoyed this semester's course content, and I can say without a doubt that my knowledge and appreciation for the Indigenous culture and those communities has grown so much as I've just been able to soak up all the information and the rich histories and the things that are involved in the Indigenous culture. I'm happy to read any feedback or answer any questions in the forums if anybody has any. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed.